Hello and welcome to the Highground presented by TRICHOMES.com. On this show, we feature leaders of the cannabis industry. We talk to everyone from farmers to CEOs and public officials, anyone making an impact on the cannabis community and beyond. On this episode, Jesse Betend talked to Casey Lee, Chief Revenue Officer of Bloom, a cannabis company based out of California. Jesse and Casey talk about the inconsistency in cannabis vape products and why Bloom's products are more consistent than others. They also talk about why Bloom's secret sauce is in their terpene profiles. Casey also discusses his path into the industry and why cannabis is being put in a good position in 2021.
So first things first, Casey, let me just say thank you for taking the time to join me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I want to start with something I've heard you talk about is one of the challenges especially within the sort of medical side of creating these cannabis extractions, is that a lot of products out there have this inconsistency, even within the same strain created by the same manufacturer. And you've compared that to, like imagine taking an Advil and having an Advil be inconsistent. Like that's obviously a huge barrier and problem for the industry. But why is it different with your products?
Well, okay, I think there's a couple reasons there, and I think also there's a couple schools of thought, right? And I think in the beginning, when we first looked at the industry and looked at the cannabis vape products, that was a huge issue, right? Just the lack of consistency. With us, the way that we wanted to figure this out was, kind of in pieces, right? The first thing we kind of did was we looked at how do we get cannabis oil to be consistent, and that's not as much of an issue now. I think I'm talking about 6 years ago, 7 years ago. But now the actual cannabis oil, especially distilled cannabis oil, is very much a commodity. So the standard for the actual product, while it still can be inconsistent, it's gotten a lot more consistent, right? So that's the first piece of how do we make sure that, what you're smoking or what you're buying is always the same product. It's just having a good base of consistent cannabis oil. So that's number one. Excuse me. The second thing is that we were looking at, okay, how do you have the same strain experience every time? And that's inherently more complicated than the cannabis oil itself, because the strain of a cannabis plant has so many different components. The way that we got around it is we found a team that specializes in terpenes, and they're one of the oldest, I think, kind of original researchers in terms of cannabis terpenes. And what they were able to do for us was effectively fingerprint the cannabis strains. And they created essentially like recipes almost, right? So that we have almost a very consistent formulation with these strains for the terpenes themselves. So as an example, our King Louis, it's one of our more popular strains. I think it's like the top 3 strain that we sell for Bloom. And what we originally did was we actually provided them with basically a very good specimen of a King Louis cannabis plant. We sent it to them. They broke it down into each individual component. And then they created this strain recipe. So every time you're smoking a Bloom King Louis, you're actually smoking that one perfect plant that we found that one time. It's that's allowed us to create that consistency, because now what we have terpenes, we have this oil, right? And we have a certain percentage that we're mixing the two together with the hardware that we're using that's customized to that formulation. And what that allows us to do is basically now we can take these strain profiles and basically send them to all the different states that we're in or the different countries. And as long as we're able to find good, consistent cannabis oil, we can create Bloom, right? Because now we're not dependent on, hey, we need to, find that specific strain of flower, extract it. In this case, we're creating, a recipe essentially that can be reproduced and recreated anywhere that they have cannabis oil.
That's awesome. When it comes to that specific recipe, I assume that those become proprietary, protected information, the kind of thing that becomes very valuable to a company like yours. Is that correct?
Yeah, I think the terpene profiles themselves are extremely important. The formulation is also very important. Those are the things that make Bloom Bloom. Like who we are as a company. I think what we were known for has always been the depth of the flavor and how complex our terpene profiles are. So, there are commonly available terpene profiles. A lot of companies are sourcing them from kind of these bigger terpene providers. But we really focused on creating specific strains that we really enjoyed ourselves. And for us, that's really the secret sauce. That's where Bloom does our magic, is in those terpene profiles and making sure that they're the right terpene profiles. And I think that comes from just experience within the industry and product development experience. And it's exactly what makes us who we are.
So if I'm understanding you correctly, it almost sounds like the actual cannabis oil itself, the actual oil itself is perhaps not as important as the way that it's used, as you put it, this recipe. Without going into too much detail or giving away company secrets, can you explain just a little bit of why that is?
Yeah, I think when we first started doing this, the cannabis oil was very inconsistent. But over time, with better equipment, better labs, with a lot of capital injected into this industry, we're seeing a lot of large manufacturing facilities who can now produce cannabis oil at a high standard, at a high volume. So because we're seeing that in all of these different states over the last few years, I think we're starting to see that market commoditize, which means you can get a very good base oil for a very standard price, right? And I think what we're seeing that in California, seeing in Nevada, we're seeing in Washington, New Mexico, et cetera. Of course, there's still some variance. There's still operators who don't know what they're doing or cut some corners here or there. But to be honest, generally, the expertise in terms of extracting, and distilling cannabis oil has been increasing and has gotten to a point where now you can access cannabis oil pretty easily, right? And I think for us that's always important because the cannabis oil is the base. That's the THC content, the cannabinoids. That's what gives you that base of the high. But the terpenes is what determines what kind of high you have, right? So if you want a high that's more of an upper, a high that's more of a couch lock, something that's in between, those feelings, the expression of that high is always based on the terpene profile itself. And so the cannabis oil will get you to that point, but then how you feel after that point, right? How you actually express it, what strains work well with you, that's all determined by the terpenes. So I think just fundamentally, whether, looking at different types of cannabis oils, different types of cannabis formulations, the fundamental thing that is important, the fundamental formula is your cannabinoid content and your terpene content. Those are the two things that really give you the effect that you're looking for. So for us, as we're looking at it, well, the cannabinoid content is becoming more standardized. The cannabis oil is becoming more available. So that piece for us is okay. It gives us some comfort in the ability to expand to different markets. Because when we started, not a lot of people could produce good cannabis oil, so we produced it ourselves. But now we're able to get to a point where we can outsource this and feel comfortable with finding good partners who can create this oil for us. So the other component then is the terpenes, right? And that's the part that we're talking about here in terms of what's proprietary and what's important to us. Because now really a lot of the focus on the product side is how do we get the best terpene profiles? And there's a couple different types, right? There's different schools of thought with this. One school of thought is that you have terpenes that might not necessarily all come from cannabis, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. Why? Because terpenes themselves are like THC. It doesn't matter the source. It doesn't matter where it comes from. The compound itself is the same no matter what source you get it from. So getting the most pure version of that is very important. And that's what's used in like food goods. That's what's used in botanicals and perfumes. It's those very pure terpenes. And so one school of thought within cannabis is that those pure terpenes produce the best formula, right, which produces the best strain profile. And that's the original kind of classic Bloom line. That's what we started with, was saying, well, let's get these strains consistently with the best ingredients every single time. So that's one school of thought. And what we're seeing now, especially in California, is a shift towards cannabis-derived terpenes, right? So that people are really looking at finding terpene profiles that do not have that consistency necessarily because they're still being extracted directly from the cannabis plant. And that's also another, it's also another product, and it's also another good product. And it has the great thing about cannabis-derived terpenes is that it generally produces a wider spectrum of ingredients of terpenes themselves. So it provides a more plant-based experience. It's like almost like you're doing like an all-natural craft soda versus getting a Coca-Cola, right? but but the way that, like there are some drawbacks because you're applying a lot of times heat and pressure to extract those terpene profiles. What happens is you modify those terpenes and you lose some of the smaller terpenes, which are called monoterpenes. And through that, you're not getting as pure of a profile necessarily. So even though you get more components, those components might be a little different. So now we have these two schools of thought. I think that a lot of consumers are shifting towards the cannabis derived, but I definitely think there's a place for both. And so for us, looking at it as a vape brand, as specialists in oil formulation, we have to consider both avenues and try to find the best balance for both.
So that's a really great transition into some of the other things I wanted to ask you about, which you had done an interview in 2020 where you were talking about a lot of growth for the company, including international growth into Canada. And then we just had this pandemic. So I want to talk about, how this past year has kind of affected Bloom and where you guys are at. But let's start at the beginning. What was your path to the cannabis industry and working with Bloom specifically?
Yeah. So to be honest, I think my path was, as with a lot of things, it's just chance, right? It's just being in the right place at the right time. So for me, it was, I had a close group of friends that, we spent a lot of time together. We hung out, we went out. And they already had some experience within cannabis. And at the time, this was about 7 years ago, cannabis extraction, cannabis vapes was just starting. And they were seeing these products on market. And I believe, through seeing this, especially through seeing it through a retail perspective, which is one of my partners, that was his past experience. He really identified that trend. And it just so happened that, they were looking at creating a product, but they didn't have the sales experience to sell the product. And I had come from, the tech world. Actually, I was at a tech startup before this. And prior to that, I was at a media startup. So I had experience within business development and sales development. It really wasn't like, CPG based. I didn't have like consumer goods experience, but sales is a fairly translatable skill depending, across multiple verticals. So, they just came and they asked me and they said, hey, we're making this product. Would you be interested in selling it? Or I think they actually asked me, how would I sell it? And I spent some time thinking about it, kind of came up with what I thought would be a nice go-to-market strategy. And, lo and behold, they were just like, hey, well, do you want to try it? And so, I saw the product they were creating. I helped work with them to put together the brand elements. And then I started taking it to market and just, would go to the stores that I would go to and just talk to them about it. And started seeing very, very good traction there. And over the course of like the first year of doing it on and off part-time, I realized the potential of what we were doing and the fact that our product was very unique relative to what everybody else on the market was at the time. So, I actually left my previous position at the startup and decided to jump in full time. So that's how I got started.
And I think you said that you had applied for like a job at Amazon at that point and were like even pitching the product to like shops along your way to work or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah. So when I started, I was doing it part time. And what I would do is I was working in Studio City in the Valley and
Uh-huh.
basically I was living in downtown. So when I started, after work, I'd finish kind of early. I finished around like 4:30. I would basically get my samples and then drop them off or to go stop by, take orders on my way home, basically everything from that like kind of like that area, Studio City area, down to downtown, I would stop by all the stores on the way back. And those are some of the first stores. That's what we started with. I think it was like CCCN in NoHo. We had a couple other stores right in that area. I think then some in West Hollywood, some in Hollywood, some just basically along the 101. And that's how we got started. Yeah, you're right. I was interviewing at Amazon. I was looking to work there and in their cloud services division, really selling the AWS product. But it really came down to, do I, work at a corporation where I can phone it in and do all right for myself, or do I take a bit of a leap here and do something I'm passionate about? And I think luckily I didn't even know then, but now I feel like I definitely made that right choice to follow where my passion was, because the fulfillment is really irreplaceable. And it's like, for a longer period, for a longer term, I think I feel a lot more comfortable with that decision. So that's how it played out.
Huh. That's, it's funny. I literally don't know what is more ubiquitous, cannabis or AWS in our world these days. Yeah, unfortunately. But I guess my point is you would have been all right either way.
I'd like to think so.
Yeah. So there was another early experience I just wanted to ask you about, where it was your product got some attention, maybe in an unconventional way. And I think this kind of came up in the context of like one of your biggest mistakes or something from the early days of marketing. But you had this experience in Barcelona. You were traveling to Barcelona. Can you tell me, do you know what I'm talking about? Do you mind telling me that story?
I don't know if it was so I was in Barcelona. I think, not sure if it was like the same context, but I do remember going, and I remember it was early on. This was probably in like 2016, I would say, maybe 2015 or 2016. I think 2016. And I brought some vape pens with me, right? And I took a picture on our old Instagram, which we've had like 4 Instagrams shut down. So unfortunately, we don't have a picture up anymore. But I took a picture, and it was right by the W in Barcelona, the W Hotel, which was on the water. It's a beautiful hotel. It looks like a sail. It's pretty cool. And I took a picture with the vape pen in front of it. And there was a club. I think, I don't remember the name of the club, but it was like a cannabis club, and liked the photo. And I decided to go find them. So I went to, I think I found their Facebook page. I asked them, hey, can I come by, this and that? And they sent me an invite through WhatsApp, and I showed up, and to be honest, it was a great experience. Like the cannabis clubs in Barcelona are really cool. I don't know like too much about the culture there and how that works, but I remember just being like, hey, you can come in, you can buy your product, smoke, and there's like good music, and it's just a really cool, chill time. And the owners of the place, I think they were German. But they came up, and I showed them the pen, and they're like, holy shit, like, we just liked your photo. So I ended up catching up and speaking with them for a while. And some of these guys, they were, it was a gray market at the time there, I believe, as well. So they were trying to figure out how to get Bloom to Barcelona. But, for me, I was like, listen, I'm not smuggling drugs internationally. That's not what I'm doing.
Yeah, I think you said that they tried to get you to start a honey company and oil in honey bear jars.
Oil. Yeah, they wanted to send oil in honey bears. I couldn't communicate with them. They didn't speak much English.
Oh no,
they were
really?
Me, they were kind of broken English, and then showing me like pictures of what they wanted me to do, and I was like,
that's wild.
This is a stretch.
Yeah.
So it was a cool time. It was a crazy experience. It was a fun experience. It was a great time. But yeah, I'm glad it didn't go further.
Yeah, that's fantastic. That's a really good story. I think you had said in that article too that moving the company to Barcelona was like at the time something that you were like kind of dreaming of or something like that. And
absolutely, yeah. I always wanted, like, it's like a small thing that you think about. You want to put something on your box that says "Made in Spain," "Made in Italy," right? Like, just to think about having a cannabis product. Like, even right now, like, we're looking a little bit at some other markets outside of the U.S., and we're looking at Thailand, for instance, as they're coming up and trying to understand what to do about their marijuana program, and just like the thought in the back of my head is like, wouldn't it be cool to have that sticker made in Thailand, and have it be my product? So I think that
Huh.
was always intriguing. Barcelona in particular is just a really cool city, and it has a lot of, it's similar to LA in some ways. And I just, it would always be very cool to be there. I think it's just something that I will continue to pursue as markets open up and as we see the world opening up to cannabis. Being able to, be out there. I think this is part of the reason why being in the industry right now is so exciting, right? There's a lot of, there's a lot of bureaucracy now. There's a lot of regulation. There's a lot of things that slow you down. There's a lot of things that are obstacles, but at the same time, you have the opportunity to essentially be a pioneer and be at the front of what's going on, right? And I think once this movement really grows and matures, we're all going to be looking back and saying, "Hey, we were there in the beginning." And I think that's kind of the sentiment that I was trying to get across. Was like, "Yo, it'd be cool to be, out in Barcelona with a vape pen, and it's my vape pen made in Spain. Like sold at this club. You could smoke it and go walk on the beach somewhere. You could take it to Ibiza." So I think like for me that would be cool. Yeah, still something that I'm striving for.
So not only have you been there, from the beginning, but you've also been through a pandemic. And I know that expansion was already part of the plans, still in the books. From what I understand, the first main expansion for Bloom is going to be Arizona, which just legalized its recreational market. How much of that is just sort of coincidence, or was that an intentional move? How much are you guys sort of like pivoting and twisting and turning based on what Thailand says or what Arizona does tomorrow?
I think it's always 50-50. It's a very good question,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like it's just, you always want to control your timing as much as possible, but the factors in the market really dictate what that ultimately is going to be. So, we were fortunate enough to be able to capture the timing for Arizona where we wanted to launch, like actually we wanted to launch last year, but, we looked at the timing and kind of how things were playing out. And we said, hey, January 22nd, it's going to go rec. So within the first few months of going rec, that's when the perfect window is. And it just so happened that we found a great partner in the Tierra Grow organization out there, and had a lot of confidence in them, and they had a lot of confidence in our brand, and we just lined things up at the right time. So, it was somewhat intentional. We wanted to hit the market around this time, knowing that it's a big market, it's going rec. But at the same time, had we not found the right partner, had we not, kind of gone through certain things here and there, we wouldn't have hit this time window. So it's a little bit of both.
Hmm. And what are the next big steps for you? What are the barriers besides, or I mean, how much is COVID still a barrier to making plans for, say, international growth? Is this kind of a wait and see moment for the industry right now?
I think that COVID for cannabis, every market is almost existing in its own bubble, right? So California is its own market, Nevada is its own market, New Mexico is its own market.
Interesting.
There's a lot of things that don't intersect between these different markets. So you kind of have to look at each one in a silo, right? But the thing is that I think with COVID in general, because of just, as a population, we've all stayed at home and haven't had as much to do. I think cannabis is generally, as a whole, benefited from this situation, which is kind of sad to say, right? It's not a good situation by any means, but um, as cannabis use has just increased, and I think that that's actually helped in terms of cannabis companies, right? And I think that hit ahead in November as the political environment also shifted, right? You saw, Biden being elected, and then within a month, oh, sorry about that.
No problem.
Within a month, we saw also the Senate going from, Republican to Democrat, and were all good signs for the industry. So I think coming into this year, cannabis actually has a lot of momentum. Now, COVID did present quite a few challenges. I think that one of the ways that customers were really finding out about products or figuring out what was good for them was walking into the store, talking to bud tenders and getting their opinion, right? And I think that piece we lacked last year, just because not as many people are going into stores having these conversations saying, hey, I like this, or this made me feel weird, or this one, is kind of like not my favorite, and
Hmm.
trying to find that, those right products for them. Because realistically, there's a myriad of products. You have, hundreds of brands in stores, especially in California. Knowing which ones work for you and which strains work for you and what's the best formulation. I mean, that really takes some it takes some help from experts like bud tenders, for instance. So I think we lost a little bit of that, but I think that overall, because the consumption increased, I think the cannabis is being put in a pretty good position as we're coming into 2021. And as far as our expansion, I think we are on track for what we want to do. Arizona looks like it's on deck here; it's ready to go. The products are being filled. The Canada looks like it's going to be a strong market as well. I think the timing is good. There is a little bit of it's still trying to find itself, but that's a good thing, right? Because it's an opportunity for us to introduce our brand and our quality and what we stand for in the market and have that position. So I think in terms of expansion, COVID didn't slow us down too much. The only thing I would say that we, slowed down a little bit was we launched in Oklahoma last year amidst the pandemic. And I think launching during the pandemic in a state where it's still a lot of, human interaction, things like that, it was a little bit tricky just to navigate. But I think we're still in a good place, and I think we did a good job with the launch. And there's plenty of people now in Oklahoma that love the product. And I think that overall with COVID, it's a, kind of step forward, step back at the same time. But as far as us expanding and finding our markets and growing within our markets, we're still continuing on our plan. And I think we haven't been affected overall too much.
So, speaking of that interaction between customers and bud tenders, I saw you make a really great point, which was that as over time, as your customers become more knowledgeable, the sort of capital or overhead required for those bud tenders, the sort of experience necessary on their side increases. I think you said something along the lines of like their product knowledge has to increase as customers start to know about like terpenes and extraction and stuff like that. And ultimately, that something that you think about kind of like an increasing cost, or something that you have to kind of like continually respond to as a leader in the industry? And obviously challenges galore arise from COVID. So what are some ways that you've tried to kind of create those interactions or think about that going forward?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think for as the industry becomes more mature, as cannabis becomes more mature, definitely having education, like proper education, is very important. And our particular industry has always been restricted in that sense, because it's not like you can go get a federal grant for cannabis research. That's like 1 in a million. So there's not a lot of formal research into the product. It's the wealth of knowledge isn't quite there. Maybe in some other countries, like Israel, for instance, has been studying cannabis for a long time. There's a lot of papers there. There's a lot of research. But here in the United States, we haven't had that same level of experience and depth from the academic standpoint. So I think that not having that, means that there's a lot of pseudoscience, right? And the more products there are, the more noise there is in the market. And there's effect-based products. There's strain-specific products. There's products that don't have any strains. There's all these different things. And I think it's not necessarily like capital, although capital is a part of it, but it's more just making sure that we are simplifying our message and doing so in a way that makes that message accessible, right? It's not necessarily me explaining to you, well, you did this type of extraction for your terpenes, so these terpenes are lost, but these ones are modified, but you still retain these. It's going to be very difficult to educate people in that way. I think it's just a matter of making sure that our messaging is concise, and that it's correct. It's backed by science. And what I'm afraid of happening, and it happens, I think, just naturally, is that there's a lot of hearsay, like, oh, I heard this brand say this, or I heard that brand say that. And I'm concerned that not all of these claims are backed by the science itself. right? That people aren't maybe getting the facts correctly before putting their messaging together, because you have a lot of people from outside the industry coming in trying to get the right information out, but there's just not that base of knowledge to start from. So for us as our brand, one of my partners is a biochemist, and that a lot of our knowledge, our product knowledge, what's happening in the body has come from him. And we've had advisors who are also biochemists, right? And I think that having that base and having those people in our world and in like within Bloom has helped us make sure that the claims that we're making are as accurate as we think is possible. It's something that we can stand behind, and that there's a scientific basis for it. So, I think my comment around that was making sure that, hey, as more brands come in, as more product comes in, and as product comes in from people that aren't from cannabis, is just making sure that there's a filter and making sure that all this information that the bud tenders, the store staff, the managers, everyone has a good base for saying, does this come from fact or is this hearsay? Is this kind of pseudoscience? And I'm hoping that the more educational resources will become available as this industry grows and as universities have access to research grants and the ability to actually study it. And I've seen, schools starting to put together these, like I think UCLA now does cannabis study. I think USC has a cannabis club. So I'm starting to see it. I'm hoping for that to grow a little bit more so that our industry can have more scientific knowledge, empirical knowledge on our products, so that when we make our claims, when we say as a brand, hey, our product does this or our product does that, that's a real thing. And it's not just us saying it because it sounds cool.
So I think I have like time for one more question before I have to let you go. And you talked about something that I think is interesting, which was in the early days of Bloom, you had this almost hesitation, perhaps, your instinct was to maybe kind of separate yourself from the stoner perception that might come along with being a cannabis brand. You talked about some hesitation about perhaps like participating in awards shows and things like that, because it kind of just felt a little bit different from the culture that you were perhaps trying to create with your brand. And then you talked about how some of those things really helped. And so maybe one of the mistakes you made early on was not like ignoring cannabis culture, but you wanted to kind of make sure to keep that in mind going forward. Can you talk a little bit about that? What does that look like? Like, how do you sort of find your own identity in something that is shaped inherently by, the history around it?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic question. I think that, it's funny because I think that has almost flipped on its head, right? 5-6 years ago, we were trying to separate ourselves, and we were the first white box, right? The first white product with the white box on the shelf. And we wanted to be clean, have clean lines, be accessible, be familiar to people that, buy vapes in grocery stores or buy vapes at gas stations, or, we wanted to be seen as that product because there was nothing like that at the time. So it was important for us to separate. Because we wanted to access that mainstream. Well, in the last 3-4 years, the product is now mainstream. Like if you're looking at the companies that are entering the market, the people that are marketing these materials, like the different brands, and I think that it's kind of almost ping pong, right? Away from that, like now the industry is all about the mainstream, and it's starting to lose that root a little bit. So finding the identity, I think it's a dynamic thing, right? It's something that we have to adjust as we navigate this industry. For me now, the way I'm thinking about it is, okay, like I understand Bloom is Bloom, right? We have a certain identity that we've created, but we really need to make sure that we do have roots in the industry, in the culture. We were there, right? We were there in kind of the beginning before the recreational shift happened. And now it's about finding finding those things. And I think that there's actually some of the bigger brands in California, like they are actually really good about recognizing that cannabis culture. And I think that the bigger brands, like the top 2, top 3 brands, they have a root in it. And a lot of the brands that are coming up have kind of ignored it to a certain extent. And I'm looking at it now like, oh, I've been there, but it's almost like we were trying to just disrupt a little bit what the sentiment was at the time. And I think in order for us to retain our identity, we'll need to continue to disrupt that, right? So if, like, now everybody's mainstreamed this thing, well, wait a second, there's history here, there's culture, there's something that we need to recognize. So that's how it's shifted, and that's why I felt like it's a great question, because it is very dynamic. It changes.
Casey Lee is the co-founder of the Bloom brand. He's also their chief revenue officer. Casey, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really did enjoy this conversation, and it's really interesting to hear how vulnerable you are. I almost kind of led this out by saying I wanted to talk to you about your mistakes, and I don't mean that in a condescending way. The way you talk about what you do is fascinating, so thank you.
No, I really appreciate the time. It was great to do this with you. The questions were fantastic. I love the research, and I always try to be as open as possible. Hopefully this helps with whoever's listening.
Absolutely.
We want to thank Casey Lee of the Bloom brand again for taking the time to talk to us. You can find more cannabis industry reporting at TRICHOMES.com, as well as more great shows like this one. If you're a member of the cannabis community and you have a story you want to share with us, reach out. You can reach the show at highground at TRICHOMES.com. Please take a second to subscribe to the podcast and write a review. It really helps others find the show. You can also join the discussion with industry insiders and get your voice heard by joining the community at TRICHOMES.com and following us on all social media. For TRICHOMES.com, I'm producer David Fortin. Thank you for listening, and be well.